Actually, I wanted to start off with something you said in 1997. You said that there are too many records on the market. I don't want to do a jazz record, but I don't know what I want to do instead.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you can tell me how that uncertainty and indecision led to the direction on the new record.
You know, there are always some doubts when you do a new album, whether you succeeded again or not, especially when you waited that long, like I did for 7 years, and you're never really sure will it actually be a nice record or not. Well, of course, I still have these doubts. The problem is, of course, for me that I don't want to add another record which is not really necessary to be published, other than to make some business, you know. And there has to be a musical reason, I find. If there is a good musical reason, then I think it might draw a lot of attention or more attention, and hopefully also that it might sell, which is not a guarantee. But without any musical reason, I think it's just, you have to be either a pop star so that you sell automatically, or have to just to be lucky, you know. And it wasn't the only reason that I waited that long. It was I think it was 7 years that I waited between my last one, Pendulum, and this one now, Enter State. This was not really the reason. It was also the reason that I was very, very busy with the Jan Gabarek group, and we played up to 100 concerts per year. And the way to compose for me is that I need lots of time in between, because let's say when I'm on tour for about 2 weeks, have 1 week off and go on tour again. During this off week, I can't work at all. Even when I try to work, it doesn't function, you know. I need more time, I need perspectives and so on. So, but of course I know that this is also a little excuse why I didn't work for 7 years for my own album. But also the other thought was what to do. And my last 2 records, Orchestra and Pendulum, have been, so to speak, solo records. I mean, I just played on my bass. On Orchestra there was a little brass ensemble on 2 tracks, but the other rest was me. And on Pendulum I played only on my own. And I knew that this, I couldn't continue that. Even if the people like it, I would never continue, because I can only duplicate myself. So I said, what else to do? And now, since I'm in an age which is not that young anymore, I'm 61, I thought I have the right to do what I always wanted to do and never dared to do. Because when you are young, you have other ideas. You wanted to show how good you can play, how wonderful you can compose, how this or whatsoever, you know. But now, since I grew that old, I had the luck to get that old, I thought finally I do that what I always wanted to do. I wanted to follow a little my classical education, because I'm a classical music lover. Not necessarily contemporary music, or not all kinds of contemporary, but the old stuff certainly I love a lot. And I love this kind of classical sounds. And I thought I'd like to use these kind of classical sounds at least once before I die on an album of me, a record of me. And but knowing that, of course, I can never compete with any classical composer. This was never my goal. But I wanted to use these sounds, the way it sounds when you follow classical composers. And that's why I use these kind of stringy sounds and French horn sounds and so on my album. And as you might know, originally there was the talk that I might play with a real orchestra. But then Manfred Eicher from ECM, we discussed it a long time, and then he said, why don't you use why don't you use different ways, samplers and so on? Because it was not necessarily only a financial reason, but also a quality reason, because these orchestras, they are not used to play that kind of stuff, which, so to speak, jazz musicians like to do. And that means it requires lots of rehearsals and still lots of recording time, and it sums up. So it's much easier to do it on a synth or on a sampler, because on a sampler, as you know, it's real strings, but only played with your fingers, you know. And then we came up with that idea, and plus I prepared myself so well that the 4 people, I mean the quartet on this album, they had already the background stuff. They heard already all these, so to speak, strings, all these classical sounds, and they added just whatever I ask them to add. In other words, it's not a quartet album. I don't even know how to say what it is. In fact, it's just a composed album with the help of four improvising and creative musicians.
I understand that you told the musicians prior to the record you can play everything as long as it doesn't sound like jazz.
Yeah, of course. I like these provocative phrases, of course. When I told these people this phrase, they laughed, knowing, of course, me very well, and knowing what I meant. And they said, "Don't you worry, it won't be jazz." Of course, they knew that improvisation in that sense is also jazz, because jazz is improvisation, because improvisation doesn't exist, or harmonic improvisation doesn't exist in classical music. So in the end, it was jazz. But what I wanted to avoid is that they did this typical noodling and doodling jazzy stuff, and I immediately understood. And that's also one of the reasons why, for example, Paul McCandless plays only on the last track, on the last stage of A Long Journey. It's the only time he plays a jazz instrument, soprano. On all the other tracks, he plays a classical instrument, bass, clarinet, or oboe, or the other one, what's it called, English horn. And the piano player, the Brüninghaus, he's anyhow classically trained, and he has this classical approach anyhow, so for him it was not a problem to play less jazzy.
Well, no, I understand you told that to the musicians because you wanted to encourage more freedom and openness. But, a lot of people claim jazz, modes to be far freer and open than a classical approach. So where does that dichotomy work for you?
Well, as a matter of fact, I don't really care.
Okay.
The problem. You see, the problem is usually that the public, or less the public, but the critics want to know, or the journalists want to know why this, why that, why that. I found more often that the fans don't care what it is. Did you follow this rule? Did you follow that? They lean back and listen to the music and say, I like it or I don't like it. The analyzing people, that's always the journalists, and they ask, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And so on and so on. Why is it half classical? Why is it not classical? I usually found that journalists have the problem when they are confronted with the music, which they cannot place really. So they have to argue. They have to say, this is not jazz anymore. This is related to this.
I'm not really going that route with the question. Rather, what I'm saying is that people look at classical music as not the most open type of thing because it is so heavily composed and therefore doesn't encourage freedom amongst the musicians. And rather, it's strictly notes on paper.
I think, when I think back now, this recording, there's more improvisation than one hears, So it's probably, in my sense, it's an ideal, almost an ideal combination between arrangements and improvisation, because I think almost nobody, or only a few people, are able to say which part is composed and which is improvised, and that's ideal for me, because it's a unit. I said once on my first, because I always want to be on all my records. I wanted to be the person who is responsible for that, what you can hear. Even when the people do whatever I think it's best for this album. For example, on my very first album, The Comers of Chloe, there was a drum solo. And I said to the drummer, you can play whatever you want, knowing that I will, afterwards, after he'd done it, I will put a choir chord underneath. So it has this kind of clamp again, so he cannot escape my arrangement or my general idea. And therefore he could play whatever he wanted, but I had this kind of smoothening chord underneath. And that's what I always thought. Whenever I release a record every so and so many years, it's my record. I want to beat my record. It's not a selfish thought, but I think it's right that I say, well, I work all year round with other people and this and doing this and that and that and that and that. Finally, when I come out with my own album, this should be me, with a wonderful help and creative help of other musicians.
Okay, well, let's talk about the idea that, again, you tried to play down the element of self-presentation. Can you elaborate on that, as well as contrast the approach you took on Pendulum, which was almost entirely self-presentation?
Well, I mean, it is probably very necessary to have to present your own ego at some point. And solo playing, this is the most egoistic stuff you can play. And but as I said previously, there's a limit. I mean, I couldn't find any other way to present my bass playing anymore without copying myself and multiplying myself. So I thought I have to go back to the communication again with other musicians. But then again, I was afraid that these other musicians might want to present themselves too much. Although I found now in all these reviews that I received so far about Endless Days, that these people actually got wonderful reviews. I mean, they said how wonderful they played and how wonderful they contributed their abilities to this album and so on. So I think the four musicians they played. How shall I say? They played freely within my limits. And I hope it's legal. I mean, I'm not a dictator at all, although I might be one when it comes down to my own album, because I never give up before it's perfect, you know. For example, the mixing we did after recording, I couldn't mix it right away because there was no time for Manfred Eicher in the studio, and it was postponed for about half a year. But I still couldn't stand the time to wait, and I flew on my own expense to Oslo and prepared it with Jan Erik Kongshaug, the engineer, and cut a little bit things out here and corrected here and corrected there before we did the final mix, you know. So I'm a perfectionist. That's absolutely true. And I even could go now into the studio again with the same recording and say, I would like to change that again, I would like to change, but of course it's by far too late now. And it's also not necessary because nobody else would hear it but me. This is stupid, of course.
Do you have perfectionist tendencies?
Yeah. But on the other hand, I'm very tolerant as well. You know, I accept that everybody can play whatever he wants or she wants. I'm only not tolerant when it concerns myself. And when it's presented on an album, on my album, and I have to listen for the rest of my life to this non-perfection situation, and that's what I hate. And I would hate myself. I won't mention anything on my I think it's my 11th own album, if I'm not mistaken. There are a few albums I hate myself that I allowed that. Whomever, you know, producer or musician, and knowing right away that I don't like it, but I was generous and said, okay, it's good enough, and so on. But even after tens of years, I think, I should have done this that way or that way or that way. But I have to say, and I'm very happy about that, whenever I met somebody who was talking about of one of my albums, even for the most awkward pieces I ever wrote, I found somebody who said, "This is your piece." So I'm, in other words, I can be happy that it seems that all these records somehow have been received well. Some better, some less, but all of them somehow they understood what I meant.
Let's go back to the idea of leading a band. I'm curious how you would describe your approach and philosophy when it comes to leading musicians.
The best answer I can tell you, if there would be a second life, which I unfortunately don't believe, if there's a second life, I believe I would become a conductor. I think this explains everything. Yeah, I like to create the music I hear in my interior. And as a conductor, you have the ability, especially when you have a good orchestra, then you have the ability to squeeze out of these 50 or whatever, 80 people, that sound, that interpretation you ask for. On the other hand, when I give it a close thought, I think I'm not dictator enough to conduct an orchestra, because it requires to be a pretty awful person, I would say. when you read all these biographies, all these famous conductors, they have been awful persons, and they failed in their private relations and so on, and they have been really awful people. But obviously, it seems that that there is a necessity to be like that. Otherwise you cannot be such a dictator. And I'm afraid my second life choice wouldn't be the best one, but I still would long for it.
Now, you recently wrote that your shift to the electric upright enabled you to discover the role of leader.
Yeah.
And that's something very few bassists experience. So how did it work? How did that happen?
Well, in fact, let me explain it like this. When I started to pick up the bass, it was purely by random, because I played cello in a school orchestra in my high school, and there was a double bass standing in the corner, and nobody could play it. And one day our music teacher, the conductor, said, "I wish somebody could play this bass." And since I started to become interested in jazz, knowing that on cello you can't play really jazz, I volunteered and said, "Well, I try to play this instrument," and I picked it up, and then after a little while I could sort of play it the classical way. I mean, just with the bow. And then, of course, I discovered that I will stay with the bass, because this was the time. This was in the early '60s, and at that time in Germany, there were lots of school bands in every high school, but they all played jazz, or they tried to play jazz. Nowadays it's rock, but at that day, these days it was jazz. And then I was hired by lots of bands, and I discovered that I should stay with that, and I gave up cello playing pretty soon and stayed with the bass. But then, since it was purely random, I discovered also, not knowing then, but knowing much later on, that bass is not enough for me. I'm not a bass player, because a bass player is always a background instrument, even to the very day. And I realized pretty soon that I have to do more than just to play bass in the background way. So I developed a kind of playing which only a handful of musicians accepted. And at that time I met a German piano player, maybe the older famous German piano player, Wolfgang Dauner is his name. And he accepted my playing, and we developed then pretty quickly, so to speak, a German Bill Evans trio, the good old trio with Scott LaFaro and Paul Motion and so on. We did the equivalent without playing that well, of course, but we went this way at least, which was very different to the other people who played in Germany then. And then after a while, when I quit that band and joined other bands, I continued to develop myself. Also with an electric bass, and in 1972 I started to play this kind of instruments, what I play now, this electric bass. And I found out that majority of the musicians couldn't bear that. They are not used to listen to the bass, because they still think the bass is in the background and he has to support us and has to be quiet whenever we ask for. And once, during the good old jazz club times, once or twice a night, the bass player might play a solo, but otherwise he has to be calm and do whatever we asked him to do. And I never accepted that. So I can even say that I ruined two bands as a permanent member. The first one was the Dave Pike set, and the second one was then the following band with the German guitar player Volker Kriegel. And with both of them, I worked for about 2 years, and I played so dominating, so much trying to squeeze my own idea in that we couldn't continue. And as a result, I had to get my own playground, which then finally was Colors, my band Colors, with Brüninghaus and Mariano and John Marshall. And this band lasted for about 8 years. And then I would say the air was out of it, and it was about time to finish. It's better to finish while you're on the peak, or slowly after the peak, than to wait until the audience notices. And I stopped it just without knowing with whom else or whatever to continue. And believe it or not, it was in 82, end of 81, in the beginning of '82, Jan Gabarek called me and said, "Are you willing to join my band? I want to do another band again." And so I said, "Well, I'm fine. I've fed up with the Bandleader, to be a band leader, and this is the longest collaboration ever. Since '82, I play with Gabarek now."
Why would you say you got fed up as a band leader?
You see, you don't earn more money than the sidemen, so to speak. This is a German special situation. We cooperate in Europe, basically. You all get the same money, and of course the records are on me, so I get the royalties and so on. But it's a lot of work, and then you have to continue to keep that band alive. You have to compose new tunes once in a while. Every 1 or 2 years, you have to present new tunes. And when you have a band like I had Colors for 7 or 8 years, then it becomes really dubious. Can you continue to stay interesting with this band? And also, don't forget that when you work a long time together with a band, and especially when you have younger players also, then there's a time, as I did as well with other bands, that you want to emancipate yourself, And for example, this was with Rainer Brüninghaus. He was somehow fed up with me, and he wants to make his own band, and blah blah blah. So he was a little bit destructive here and there, and so on. But this is very normal, And so when I realized that, I said, no, let's rather stop it. And I was fed up simply, and I wanted to lean back as well, and not to be responsible for the order of the tunes and whatsoever. And this was just fine for then to join Gabarek.
In your Pendulum liner note, you said the much-touted emancipation of the bass frequently nullified the instrument's traditional subservient role in the ensemble. Mm-hmm. And, most bassists feel that that's been the exception rather than the rule. So what made you feel that way?
Frankly spoken, a bass is kind of a silly instrument. And how can somebody pick an instrument which is not made to play solos on it, or to play to be a leader? Even Charlie Mingus, he was an excellent bass player, of course, but he didn't lead from his bass, but he led from himself, from his ego. And of course, after I rediscovered this kind of electrical bass, I noticed that I can also lead acoustically with the bass out of a sudden, which Mingus couldn't. When somebody plays full force, you can't hear the bass. At least at that time, you couldn't hear it, live. And nowadays, you can actually do whatever you want on a bass, on any instrument. And I realized it also when I do now here and there some other things with a German all-star group, sort of a jazzy music, forte de bar music, good old forte de bar music. I realized that the front line always complains about my volume, and because they're not used that you can hear the bass. It's a what shall I say? I'm in between the lines, in between the how we say in German, in between the seats,
Now, I understand when you're not recording or performing, you don't necessarily spend a lot of time with the bass.
No, not at all, no. I take care of my instrument, but I don't love it, because my instrument is just a device to transport my ideas and even my feelings. Yes, that's correct. But I don't love it. I'm not the type of person who has to touch the instrument every day. For example, I'm home now since about 6 days, and knowing that in tomorrow I have to go again, to leave again for the next section of a tour. Believe it or not, I didn't use my car. It's in the garage. My bass is still in the car. I didn't touch it, and I don't need to touch it, knowing that it's not required because of technical reasons, and also not of musical reasons. I just don't need to touch it. It doesn't interest me. I can give you another example. because I'm only interested in results, not in the procedure to get somewhere. For example, in the good old days, when you still had the chance to go to a jazz club, and there was a jam session, and then we all went, or some people went on stage, including myself, and we played together, maybe some freer improvisation or some modal improvisation, and we played for half an hour, and it was really dynamic, it was wonderful, it was, so to speak, for that moment being, it was perfect, so to speak. Then I put down the bass and left the stage, and all the other musicians looked at me and said, "What's going on? Why are you leaving?" And I said, "Because we just had a nice half an hour, and it was perfect, and when we continue, it's only a repetition. And I'm not interested in playing, I'm interested in having a result." See, that's the big difference to other musicians.
Now, despite the fact that you take that approach, there's been a marked evolution in your playing over the years. How do you account for that, given the fact that you spend long stretches away from it?
I love music, and it's not quite necessary that I play myself. I can listen to other music as long as I like it and love it and so on. And I have only some periods that I feel that I have to present myself, and my ego is lacking of something, so I have to go on tour again, but it has always to be the bass because I have no other choice anymore. In my age, I cannot switch to another instrument anymore.
Does the idea of age enter into your mind often these days?
More and more, of course. I found out that, of course, every decade you think, oh my God, when you are 30, you think, oh God, when I'm 40, then I'm old. When you are 40, then you think, oh my God, 50 is old. And so on and so on and so on. So my first crisis was when I was 39. This was my first crisis, because then I thought youth is finally over. And I discovered with 40, no, it's not over. And I didn't suffer. When I was 50, I didn't suffer at all. And the first time, and I think it's definite, when I turned to become 60, I realized now there's under no circumstance any excuse anymore. Now you approach the last section of your life, you know, however long it might take. But 60 is a figure. As long as you are 50, you can say, "Hi, I'm still young. I'm still young." Even 59, I'm still young. 60, bang, this means something, you know. So I think more and more, not that I'm afraid, but I'm not the youngster anymore. I'm not a young talent anymore.
Are there any spiritual elements at work for you?
No. I hate religion. Because I think this, just a simple explanation, the worst wars are always religious wars. They always take the right from Lord said, or whoever said, you know, I have to do this, and he allows me to do that, and this is the most crucial, these have to be the most crucial wars, so I hate religions.
You've been unafraid to explore effects and alternative directions, and you know, you've even added additional strings to your instrument. Yet, at least from my perspective, you've been relatively immune to the wrath of purists and, you know, other conventional bassists.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you think that's because the electric upright isn't burdened by a history of gimmickry and wanking, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, again, the regular bass doesn't have many possibilities, and this was not the reason why I switched to electric bass. The reason was that the music became very loud in the mid and 60s. It became very loud, and with a double bass you couldn't be heard anymore. And then, of course, I realized I have to go the electric way, and I added some pickup on my double bass, finding out that when you play a certain volume, then you suffer from feedback because of this resonance body. So it was only logical to find an instrument which has no feedback, and then it was a solid board at the time being, you know, there was in an antique shop an instrument like that, totally broken, but I was able to repair it, or to have it repaired, and added a pickup, and so on and so on. And then I thought, from now on, this is my new instrument. But then I discovered, tragically enough, that it was absolutely wrong, because I still played the way I played on a double bass, and I simply didn't change the attitude with an electric bass. And I found out that this doesn't work. And it took me about approximately 1 year until I felt comfortable on this current, I mean, not the current model, but on this kind of instrument of electric bass. And then at the same time, I found out that you can out of a sudden you are a different bass player or even a different musician, because you can lead, you can tell the people where to go on stage, which you couldn't do before. Not at all. Everybody else could lead you. The drummer could lead you, the trumpeter and the piano player. Everybody could lead you to some, but never the bass player, simply because of volume. But even when you put an amplifier on these days bass players, on double bass players, they are good enough pickups, meanwhile, that they can play loud as well. I mean, hearable as well, audible. But still, they cannot lead because it's still this kind of backgroundish sound they have, which is not meant to lead. But the instrument I have, I don't know because of which reasons, you can play background, you can play in the middle or in the foreground. You can do whatever you want, and whatever you do, it can be heard. So they have to deal with you, which of course, I repeat myself, many musicians don't like, certainly not the conservative ones.
Well, I'm also curious about Eberhard Weber, who's done the very beautiful artwork for most of your CDs.
That's my wife. He started to paint when we got married in '68, slowly, or after 2 years or so. And I always liked her artwork, and she developed a lot. When you compare, for example, my first cover, Colors of Joy, now on the last one, there are big steps in between. And I always liked her paintings. Plus, I didn't see any reason why I should change her, why I should ask somebody else, because she deserves it also that she continues with me, and we are together since 33 years now, and I don't see any reason why I shouldn't ask her to do. And also, don't forget, she paints maybe 10, 15 paintings per year, and then I have a lot of choice which one I can choose, and I tell her I'm intending to do a record here, a record there, and then I can pick the one I want, of course with her acceptance. There have been also situations I wanted one picture and she said no way. Then of course I have no choice, then I take something else, or we discuss it, as it is within a marriage.
I want to ask you a question about Kate Bush. You once implied the idea that when working in that context with her, that every note had to be negotiated in advance in order to be sold later. And I'm wondering if you feel that, the expression of a genuine creative muse is possible in a rock context.
Well, she called me once when I was in Hamburg, and I couldn't even believe that it was her, because in the hotel there was a message with it was Kate Bush and so on, and I called her back, and then she told me that she loved the music of ECM generally, and my music also in particular, and she wanted me to participate in one of the other albums and so on. And for me it was the first experience. I flew to London then, where she lives, and she sent me a tape before with the 2 tracks she wants me to play on, and asked me to think about counter melody or whatever, So I did something like that and flew over, and I thought, as it is among the jazz people or jazz productions, I fly over and we go to the studio, and within 2 hours the first tune is done, and within another 1 hour the second tune is done. No, it was very different. It was my first experience with the pop world, so to speak. They check every note, everything. So it took the first tune took maybe 6 or 7 or 8 hours, and the second one the second day at the same time. And this explained also to me why these pop people are so very long. They need so much time to produce their albums. Also, that they never decide right away what to do. So when I came up with some ideas, I could do this, yes, let's record it, and we have 48 tracks and so on, so I recorded this idea, And I said, maybe we can do it even this way. Yes, let's record it. So I recorded, I don't know how many tens of ideas and so on. And in the end, only one was accepted, or nothing of this was accepted. Because these people have the attitude, they don't decide right away, they decide later whenever they mix. And this is very unusual. Certainly for the older ECM production way, because in the 70s, when I started with ECM, recording was only 3 days. 2 days recording, 1 day mixing. This was for all these records, and only later on, when it became more complicated with synths and whatsoever, then it took longer. But this also requires that you concentrate a lot and you decide within these 2 days what to do. And you have no more time. But pop people, they take half a year, or even longer. And they never decide right away. And this was a very interesting experience for me. And it continued, the same way continued later on, a few years later when she wanted to meet back. I think I played on 3 of her albums. By the way, I sent her the stays a few weeks ago. We usually talk every half year for half an hour on the phone.
You said the bass is my lifelong occupation, but also my greatest adversary. Why is it your greatest adversary?
I meant that the bass is not really my instrument. In the second life, as I said, I want to become a conductor, but I probably have to stick with the bass because I know that I'm not to praise myself, but I know that I play the bass more unusual than most of the other bass players. I'm not speaking of quality, or I'm speaking of a difference, And I play different than anybody else, and but I'm never satisfied with what I'm doing, and I always so. As I say a little bit in a funny way, I say. My bass usually beats back. Whenever I play it beats back, and I don't like that, of course. So I have to practice here and there a little bit, and I don't want my bass to beat back. You know what I mean when I say beats back? Which means there are still things I haven't discovered yet, and the bass knows a little bit better than me.
So it's still a constant process of evolution and discovery for you.
Of course, it never stops. Of course, it never stops. Of course, I can relate on a lot of routine. And I can survive most of the jobs which are offered to me, which is good news because I go there and without trembling, without hesitating or without having too much fear. Of course, there is always a little tension when I don't know anybody and they present some music which I don't know. But I have so much routine that I usually survive in all these and under all these situations, unless somebody comes with an insanely written out part for bass guitar and wants me to play exactly the same notes and so on. Then of course, but then I'm frank enough to say, why don't you call it the same guitar player who played it, bass guitar player who played it? Why do you want me to play it? There was one occasion that a composer called me from LA and said, I have an orchestra piece. I wrote something for Freddie Hubbard and orchestra and so on. Would you please participate? And I said, well, I don't mind. And then I said something which is probably very unusual. I said, do you want a bass player or do you want me? And there was a silence for a little while on the phone. And then, of course, he said, no, I want you. But this was the last time he called me.